Hello, everyone, and very welcome to our fourth in our series of webinars that we're promoting with the assistance of the Dutch Embassy. I'm Duncan Dollimore. I'm Head of Campaigns at CyclingUK. Hope you find this afternoon interesting. What we've been doing over the last few weeks is a series of webinars which are all about creating a new normal and what cycling in the UK looks like post-COVID. And today we're specifically focusing on decarbonising transport and the role that cycling can play in that. And so what we're hoping to do is look this afternoon at how cycling infrastructure, if we combine that with efforts to reduce emissions, can provide a solution, particularly in our towns and cities. We've got a fantastic group of speakers. I have to apologise at the start for those who were hoping to hear from Steve Chambers this afternoon. Steve is a campaigner and actively involved in lots of transport issues, but he also recently co-authored a fantastic report that Transport for New Homes wrote about garden towns, and garden villages, and whether the reality or the vision wasn't coming through. So we were going to hear from Steve about that this afternoon. What we're going to do instead, Steve's had to pull out because he's not feeling particularly well. I'm just going to summarize a couple of paragraphs of that when we get to the relevant point and ask the other speakers to deal with some of the principles around that. So with apologies that we don't have Steve, what I'm going to do now is just introduce very briefly the other four speakers that we've got. They'll let you know who they are and talk for sort of 60 seconds or so, and then we'll get straight onto the main issues. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Gillian Annable, who is the Professor of Transport and Energy at the University of Leeds and also a policy advisor for Campaign for Better Transport.
So sorry. Yeah, just a quick hello from me. As I know, we've got lots of opportunities to speak throughout this webinar. I'm particularly interested in this subject. Some of you may or may not know I'm very involved in the decarbonisation of the UK transport agenda, and I come at it from trying to understand the non-technical solutions to decarbonisation. And of course, really important is understanding all kinds of trip patterns, and particularly what we can change over to active travel and, if you like, zero carbon modes. So I get quite exercised about this whole topic, but I also have to question the degree to which cycling can actually contribute a huge amount to the decarbonisation agenda. There's lots of opportunity to discuss that, so I won't go into my reasons why. I'll try and explain some of my scepticism so that we can flush that out as we go through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gillian. And if I could now introduce Jose. Jose Besselink is an urban planner at Rotterdam and the municipality of Rotterdam. And I think we might hear a bit from Jose today about tactical urbanism, which has been something which has been very much in the news in recent months. Jose?
Hi everyone. Yeah, as Duncan said, I'm an urban planner working for the city of Rotterdam since 12 years. I've been involved in the inner city development, and what I find very important is that creating an attractive city for cycling is creating an attractive city for people in general. So it shouldn't be the main objective, but it's a city for people that should be our main goal. And I'm happy to share my experiences on both tactical interventions as well as policy examples.
Thank you, Jose. Our next speaker is Eric Teteru, who's a consultant for urban planning and bicycle inclusive mobility. No pressure, Eric, but when I looked at your website earlier today, I saw a fantastic quote saying, all the effort in the world doesn't matter if you're not inspired. So you have an hour and 10 minutes to inspire us, Eric.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's quite something. Yeah, well, I strongly believe that you have to be inspired to do the right things, and that's why I'm pretty sure that it helps me to get more and more involved into bicycle inclusive mobility and to bring it to a higher level, as I'm myself already converted to the new normal for several years. So for me, the bike is the yeah. By the way, I'm sorry for the church bells banging quite loud. I'm not sure if you're all hearing the noise by now, but normally they only do that at 12 o'clock, but now I seem there's a service going on or something like that. Anyway, for me, cycling is important, not just as a sport, or but especially for commuting and for everyday life. And it makes me happier, it makes me healthier, and I think it would help other people's as much as it would do to me. So that's why I am involved for many years in urban planning and in mobility. And that's also why I devised the concept of hybrid-oriented development, which is, let's say, a Dutch version of TUD with a central place for the bike in it.
Thank you very much, Eric. And last but certainly not least is my colleague Roger Geffen, Policy Director at CyclingUK.
Thank you, Duncan. Yes, so just to explain my role, Roger Geffen, Policy Director. My role is effectively within CyclingUK to make sure we have the arguments and the evidence to present to decision makers, which is my role, but also to feed Duncan and his campaigns team when we need to make a bit more noise to get the message through to those decision makers. So very much the sort of the authoritative voice that behind the campaign that Duncan so effectively leads. This is in the context where cycling has really kind of shot up political agendas during coronavirus, and I think we've been making the case to decision makers both nationally and locally that cycling is a really important part of how we recover from the coronavirus crisis in a way that gets us better ready to respond to the climate crisis and physical inactivity crisis and the air pollution crisis and all those other crises that were there all along. But it's also in the context where we've then got a planning white paper on the horizon, a transport decarbonisation strategy on the horizon, and we've got to make sure that cycling plays its part in that. And Gillian's points about the limitations of what cycling alone can do are absolutely right. We've got to reduce the need to travel in order for cycling to be able to play its part more strongly. And I think that I'm not going to be disagreeing with Gillian's scepticism about the role of cycling on its own.
Well, we'll come back to that issue, Roger, in shortly. But if we can just start with, I'm going to stick with you, Roger, on a very general point, because when we were discussing hosting this webinar, you expressed the view that you always thought that policymakers got the idea that cycling had a role in relation to climate change, but you were never quite sure that they grasped what the extent of it was, or how to actually maximise the benefits. So I wonder whether you've got any take on sort of why do you think that's not been grasped so far?
Why has it not been grasped so far? We have a long history of seeing cycling as a marginal activity. Eric touched on the idea that people see it first and foremost as a kind of a recreational activity and as a sport, and do not see it as a serious mode of transport. The Dutch do see it as a serious mode of transport. In the UK, we really struggled to get that through, to really get the idea through that cycling, and indeed just more local journeys, more sustainable, more healthy journeys, is an important part of the wider transport mix. We've tended to think that, from the 1960s onwards, transport is mostly about vehicles, things that go further and faster, and that has really marginalised walking as well as cycling, and to a large extent buses too. We've really got to shift that balance if we're going to travel less and travel more sustainably and healthily in order to create better places as well as cleaner air and a more sustainable future for future generations.
Thanks, Roger. Just, you mentioned there that we haven't looked in this country at cycling as a means of transport, and we've struggled with it. Obviously, Jose, that's not been quite the situation in the Netherlands, but I wonder whether that issue of the extent to which cycling can address issues and the opportunities to grasp them and maximise the benefits, has that looked different from a Dutch perspective than the perspective that Roger's painted in relation to where we are in the UK? Well,
I guess nowadays we are a cycling paradise, but we haven't been like this for a long time. It was only in the beginning of the 80s that we have launched a bicycle plan in Rotterdam, and only from 2000 onwards that cycling was no longer part of this car or public transit policy, but it became a thing on its own. So I believe that you just have to make a fierce choice in politics to create like this context for a more bike-friendly city or country. And it could be helpful to use, well, we're no longer allowed to organize big events due to the crisis. But for example, in Rotterdam, the start of the Tour de France in it was 2010 was really helpful to accelerate change. And we were forced to invest in the cycling infrastructure because of organizing this event. So it's also interesting to seek for interesting connections for your policy to address this topic.
Thank you, Jose. Just I'll come back to that issue of capitalizing on events and timings and urgency in a minute, but perhaps it's a good point to bring you in, Julian, in relation to the comments that you made at the start. I don't think anybody's suggesting that cycling is an answer in itself to all of the climate issues that we have, but perhaps you could expand on your thoughts and reservations, if there are some, about the extent to which it can provide some solution.
Thank you. Yes, well, I'll explain. I do just want to preface, just in case it doesn't come across, that nothing that I say is suggesting that we don't need to massively invest in cycling and increase the amount of cycling. So I do need to preface that. I'm trying to strike a balance between getting that message across that we do need to invest, but also some perspective on just how much we can achieve. And in order to achieve the maximum that we can with cycling, we very much need to, if you like, pull the drawbridge up behind it. As we invest in cycling, we need to cap and somehow constrain and bring down the amount that we travel by car. And that's, otherwise we can get both. We can get an increase in cycling and an increase in car use. So I don't know if it's possible to put my slides up, but in order to really just quickly put what I'm about to say in context, when you look at the travel patterns of UK residents, we have good data, National Travel Survey here. And if you could put slide 2 up for me, please. There's a range of journey distances, as everywhere. And this graph shows you that journeys of less than 5 miles, 65% of all the trips that we do on average are less than 5 miles. And that is a statistic that's often quoted a lot, quite rightly, to say, look, look at how many journeys are less than 5 miles, and so many of them are done by car. And that's really not necessary. If we planned better, if we had better infrastructure, etc., and they could be undertaken by walking and cycling. Absolutely agree with that. No issue with that. The problem is that big bulk of journeys only represents, as you can see on this graph, 18% of all the distance that we travel. And actually, it represents even less in terms of the total carbon from passenger transport, because many of those short journeys are already undertaken by sustainable modes, if you like. So the other end of the spectrum, just to go to the extreme, it's only 3% of trips undertaken that account for 1/3 of all the distance that we do as passengers, because those very long distance journeys that are undertaken very infrequently actually still make up the bulk of the distance that we do. And the majority of those journeys are done by car. So they're very carbon intensive. So until we actually really tackle that top end, then we're not going to get as much with carbon. And then if we can just quickly go to slide 2. Slide 2 again is from the National Travel Survey, just to again put this in context. A lot of the journeys less than 5 miles, a lot of the cycling effort is aimed at the commute, which we do want to transition, absolutely. But again, when we look at the bigger picture, we can see that the vast majority of miles are on distance that we do across all modes is undertaken for leisure and shopping purposes. So we need to get much better at understanding cycling for recreation, actually, in order to actually undertake a lot of the social journeys and become part of of the activity, of the leisure activities that we do. We need to get better at that, not shy away from talking about it as a recreational mode. And then finally, just if we could just go to the last slide, and this is not finger pointing. No, sorry, so not the last slide, sorry, the one before, the one you just had up. This is not finger pointing, but the whole rationale for me sort of just trying to sort of say this is that when we talk about the Netherlands and we hold it up as this place with all of this cycling, which it has, I think it's something like 29% of trips in the Netherlands are undertaken by bike, compared to only 2% here. And that represents about 8% of distance that the Dutch travel, and it represents only about 1% of the distance that we travel here by bike. So huge, you know, and no wonder we look at it and think, gosh, I wish we could be like that. But the point is that the Dutch travel by car just as much as we do. And their total carbon footprint from their surface traveling, so leave air out of it, but their total carbon footprint from traveling per capita, average carbon footprint, is the same as ours. So we can do great stuff at the bottom end. We can talk about it as potentially a gateway into more sustainable lifestyles, but that will only happen if we cap and we constrain car use, which actually they haven't done in the Netherlands. They love their cars, they love their big cars, and they love driving them a lot. And they're not really, you know, they don't have road pricing, they don't have high fuel taxes. They just let car travel be whatever it is, and that is the problem. And that is what the message that I'm trying to get across.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Probably an appropriate time to bring you in, Eric, if possible, in relation to that, because I know you have some fairly firm views in relation to the policies to deal with land planning to reduce the need for some of those journeys. So perhaps you could expand, if you could, on how the Dutch sometimes link those land use planning and other policies to reduce the need to drive and the length of journeys.
I'm mute.
You're on mute. I think you're muted, Eric.
It's better now. Yes. So I'm sorry. Yeah. Let me first give a brief reaction to Gillian's very refreshing views on, let's say, the numbers, but also the Dutch policy on car use. So I agree with you that we do have not a very severe or strong policy to reduce car use. I think that we are very satisfied that there's already so many people are cycling for also for daily use, and that it's still, well, quite a political discussion to reduce, let people drive around, and that's all true. On the other hand, if we look at the distances we travel, about 60% of the Dutch live within 10 miles from their work. And from those 60%, a lot of them still go by car. So we totally agree that there's a lot to do also in our country. Yeah? Still, we do have good infrastructure, we do have a cycling culture, and yet there's a lot of people we need to get on and try to focus to get out of their cars. But regarding your second graph, I think it was, then you stated the distance between 5 and 35 miles. So that's quite a very wide range. And I agree, 35 miles, there are not so many Dutchmen even that go around by bike for that distance. But let's say up until 5 to 10 to 15, you see that more and more people, especially with e-bikes and speed pedelecs, do achieve that, also for daily commute. So I think there's some difference going on. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'll come back to you in a second. Just perhaps I should mention for the audience that if anybody has any questions, please put in your question in the Ask a Question box that's on your screen, and I'll try and come to some of those. We might not get to all of them, but a little bit later on. But just going back to the comments that Gillian was making in relation to the limitations of how cycling could address some of the issues about decarbonisation. Roger, we've obviously got the government in the UK effectively consulting at the moment, or about to consult, on their decarbonisation plan. That's obviously something you'll be planning to respond to, but why would you say that cycling is necessary or integral to that decarbonisation plan, and how does it need to link with other policies that we're expecting to come around in the coming months?
Well, firstly, let's just, cycling is such an integral solution to so many other problems as well. And I think the important point from, just picking up Gillian's argument is that it's fairly easy to make the case that cycling could play a much bigger role in replacing many of those 65% of trips that are under 5 miles, and those under 5 mile trips would mostly be in urban areas. And by doing that, we would make a huge amount of progress in reducing urban congestion, urban pollution, urban road danger for the kids who can't play on our streets, and creating a better quality of life, reducing noise. It would also contribute to reducing carbon, but Gillian's absolutely right that it's on its own, that would not be enough. I want to just kind of put a bit of a counterweight to Gillian's. One calculation that we made some years ago is that if the average Brit making an average 4 mile long car commute were to switch that to cycling, they would reduce their carbon footprint, on average, by about 7%. That is not insignificant, but I think it's absolutely right that it's not enough, as it were, to not deal with those long trips that Gillian's talking about. If we are going to really decarbonise transport, cycling's got to play its part, but it's got to be about replacing the long trips, not just the short ones. And therefore, we've got to be looking at land use policy, which is why I talked about the government's planning white paper as such an important opportunity to say, we've got to start thinking about where are we going to put the houses? How are we going to locate the houses and design the new housing developments and other developments in places where they foster much shorter journey patterns? Because once we've got shorter journeys, then cycling can play a much bigger part than Gillian is suggesting in the wider transport decarbonisation agenda, because it's much easier to shift journeys to walking and cycling and public transport if they are shorter in the first place.
Thank you, Roger. I'll come back to the whole issue of land use planning shortly and where we build and where developments are. It was an issue that Steve Chambers was going to speak on in terms of new housing development, so I will come back to that. But I just wanted to go back to you, Jose, in relation to some points that you were making or started to make in relation to opportunities, and you mentioned Rotterdam. We've heard a lot in the last couple of months as cities across Europe and elsewhere have started to accelerate measures to introduce sometimes temporary infrastructure for walking and cycling. And there's been a lot of conversation about the need to grasp the opportunity to build back better, that there could be a green recovery, and those phrases have been out there. And obviously that's linked with a growing conversation about what's sometimes called tactical urbanism, which is, I know, something we spoke about the other day. So but perhaps you could expand on what you mean by tactical urbanism and whether you think that's something that can provide a catalyst for some greater pace of change in relation to the issues that we're talking about now.
Well, tactical urbanism is short-term action with long-term influence, always related to your long-term ambition. And in Rotterdam, we have been working on a city lounge strategy for our inner city, which was mainly about creating an attractive place for people. The city center should be the people's lounge, so to say. And related to that, we also had policy for eliminating car parking on street, as well as a cycling plan. And maybe it's possible to show the third slide that I've sent you. This is an example of one of the tactical interventions that we implemented in our city. We had an issue with, it's the third slide, because change is hard, and it's it's easy to write a vision. We're very good at that. We are like a planning paradise in the Netherlands. So there's visions for every single subject, also for cycling. But then how to come to action? And we were thinking, inspired, by the way, by New York, where they had this commissioner, Jeanette Sadikan, who's, I think, famous for the tactical interventions now. And they had parklets in New York and San Francisco, but we figured, why don't we just invent a bike parklet? We have like a target in the city center to eliminate 3,000 on-street parking spaces. And at the same time, we are dealing with, a lack of bike parking. So this picture in the middle is a bike parklet, and it was an experiment for, I believe it was a 3-month period, together with entrepreneurs as well as residents in a pilot street. We have realized 5 bike parklets, and it was just a matter of trial and error. The funny thing is that since it was an experiment, after this 3 months time, people were so enthusiastic about this that we were not even able to eliminate these 5 spots, but even 25. And this is the point I wanted to make, that short-term interventions can help you to accelerate change for the long run. So now in this street, we were able to create more bike parking and even more green. And after this pilot in one street, it became a citywide program. And now local residents can apply for a bike parklet when there's enough support in their street. And we'll put it on street for like this 3 to 4 months period of time. And if it works, we'll just make it permanent. If it doesn't, we'll remove it and just create another car park. But actually, that never happened.
Thank you very much, Jose. Eric, if I could just come to you at that point. There was a slide there that Jose had in relation to the whole issue of ambition and policy, experiment and change. And she talked very clearly about the issue of trial and error. It's a really relevant sort of phrase in the context of what's happening in the UK at the minute, because there's loads of conversations about temporary infrastructure. And the UK government has made various monies available in England in relation to temporary infrastructure. And there's been great conversations about whether that's the right thing to do, whether we should be looking at permanent. Will the temporary infrastructure become permanent? And that links in with the tactical urbanism question. When that was mentioned the other day, I think when we were speaking, I got the impression that you had some reservations about tactical urbanism and how that might link in with long-term land use policy. Are you in agreement with Jose in relation to what she's just said, or have you some reservations?
Well, I truly have some reservations if we talk about tactical urbanism and things like what you mentioned, trial and error. If it's too much about error and not enough trying for the best solutions. So the idea is that if you paint something on the street, it makes sense for a while, but there has to be a long-term vision to get it to a higher level. Now, the example that Jose showed it's a great example, I guess, with a bike parklet, because this one was invented by the city of Rotterdam, and then it was part of an innovation award that we did with the Tour de Force project. And Tour de Force project, that's like a big public-private participation in the Netherlands, where all governments and a lot of interest groups work together to promote cycling. And they won that innovation award, and which gave them some money to put more and more of those into the streets of Rotterdam. But it also helped to expose this to other cities. And now it's also in the city of Leiden and the city of The Hague, where you see this kind of solution. So I do like those kind of interventions if it's followed by some main support and a vision for the long term that helps to make things work better for sure. And one more thing to mention about that, because we talk now about local interventions. In my first contribution, I was saying something about the national policies, but I think the best we do, if we look at cycling, is for the last 10, 15 years, is all done on the local or regional level. And that is where it also gains a lot of support, because it also contributes, as also Roger said, to better space consumption, more health for people, and a more livable streets.
Thank you. I'm going to come on to the whole issue about planning of developments and where they're located, and the issue of destination shifting as well as mode shifting. But before I do, I just wanted to touch on an issue which I know Gillian and Roger both are very passionate about. Gillian, you talked about short journeys and some reservations about the impacts in relation to climate change contributions because of short journeys. To what extent does the advent of e-bikes and the possible use of those for slightly longer journeys than we sometimes talk about for cycling and walking, to what extent does that throw up opportunities that we really need to grasp?
I have a really strong view about this, or maybe it is more of a passion, but I truly believe e-bikes could be the real revolution. You know, for how long have we heard about, you know, electric cars, the electric car revolution, and that has always bugged me because there's no revolution. It's just a car powered by something a bit different. There's nothing revolutionary about it at all. But e-bikes, I think, could be truly transformative, precisely because of what Eric said earlier about their ability to target this bulk of trips in the middle that are, if you like, medium length journeys. It doesn't matter, but they're sort of maybe 5, 10, 15 miles in length, and they're really difficult to transition across to public transport a lot of the time. A lot of bus journeys that are longer than 5 miles, and they stop everywhere, and they're really long journeys in comparison to what you could do by car. So they're really not great for public transport or for trains. And so the e-bike actually is the only solution that could rival the car, I think, in those circumstances. But of course, in and of itself, it's not good enough. It still needs the infrastructure. And where we place emphasis on getting infrastructure right when we do it right, and we do it well, it's still very much in the denser urban areas. And we have done some work just recently here to analyse a lot of it was a big data project to look at journey origin destination data in the UK for lots of different types of trips, not just work trips, and the length of those trips, to look at the demographics in different population areas, and to look at the road infrastructure and the topography and things like that. And we have calculated where the most carbon could be saved by really targeting e-bike solutions, the infrastructure, and really getting maybe even shared bikes into those areas. And they are not the centre of towns. They are the less dense suburbs, and they are the sort of the small, medium towns where you could really revolutionise the car trips and these medium length car trips. But that's, as I say, not where we are targeting the infrastructure, certainly not where the shared e-bike schemes are going. They are going into the centre of all the sexy cities that we keep talking about, and they're the places that really don't need them. So the conversation I want to have is not just about how great e-bikes could be, but really about targeting them so that we can accelerate and decarbonise where get the biggest bang for our buck.
Roger, just on that, because I know you would never forgive me if I didn't bring you in on an e-bike conversation, where e-bikes and the points that Gillian makes in relation to that. We've just had some statistics out last week about the growth in bike sales in the UK over the COVID period. And e-bikes didn't increase at the same rate in terms of the sales. And I think that touches on some of your views about trying before you buy and the opportunities for people to actually get into riding an e-bike without spending a huge amount of money to start with.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think Gillian's just made an incredibly strong case for what e-bikes can do, and it really is about taking cycling beyond its current demographic, its current journey patterns, its current very sort of urban-centric uses, and it's mostly young to middle-aged male predominance in the UK. That is not a feature of Dutch cycling, of course. So people cycle further. It's a much more healthy mix. The government has provided subsidies for every other kind of electric vehicle, electric cars, electric vans, electric taxis, electric motorbikes, electric lorries. They subsidise all of them, apart from electric bicycles. It is completely nonsensical. The Bicycle Association commissioned research from Transport for Quality of Life, which showed that, pound for pound, investment in e-bikes delivers twice the benefits in terms of carbon savings that investment in e-cars does, and that's before you even begin to add in the physical activity, the pollution reduction, and all those other wider benefits. The carbon savings alone are twice as cost effective invested in e-bikes, and yet we're still investing all of the electric vehicle money is going into electric everything else, which is completely sort of just getting things the wrong way around.
Thank you. It was about this point of the webinar that I was going to introduce Steve to talk about specifically the Transport for New Homes report about garden villages and garden towns. So I'm going to just sort of do a little bit of a summary of what that report found. Apologies if I'm looking across at notes a little bit on this, but I was expecting Steve to be leading on this. But effectively, Transport for New Homes produced a fantastic report, which was published in the recent weeks, looking specifically at 20 garden communities that had been planned largely in England in relation to matters. And the gist of the report was that the vision and the idea and the concept of them was very great. Nobody set out, and this was Steve's comment to me a couple of days ago, nobody set out to design a garden town that didn't factor in active travel, but somehow between design and actual delivery, that all disappeared. And what the report said was that effectively the transport assessments assumed high levels of traffic going in and out of the garden communities, and instead of being planned with new stations, buses or mass transport at their heart and streets designed specifically for pedestrians, they were marketed in the context of new roads, better access to motorways and distance communities. And the emphasis on roads anticipated out of town sprawl rather than walking communities. And the prognosis of the report was that unless there was a change of emphasis and funding to promote sustainable transport, the risk was that these would end up completely at odds with the government's vision as to what they should look like. And Steve was mentioning to me the other day that there was no budget in these garden communities for sustainable travel, but a £1 billion road budget associated with them, and a risk that from 20 towns alone, we could end up with 200,000 car-dependent developments or properties, and occasions where people would have to drive several miles just to go to the newsagents to pick up a pint of milk or a paper. So that is a very clumsy and fag packet summary of what Steve would have said much more eloquently. But in terms of that description of how we're designing towns and places that design out choice rather than enabling active travel, is that, Gillian, something that accords with your own observations of what we're doing in the UK?
Entirely. There's been some fantastic analysis over the years trying to, as we do, we look at journey patterns, we look at the amount of car use that people are doing, and we try and understand its ups and its downs, and sort of get beyond the aggregate to understand who's increasing, who's reducing. And we've had this phenomenon called peak car, where average per capita car use had originally plateaued before the recession last decade and subsequently declined a little bit. We've seen a bit of an uptick. There are lots and lots of talk about what that was about. And we actually saw that the pattern was very different in different parts of the country and for different people. And for those people, if you like, the middle-aged families, not living in London, but the centre of cities, car use had actually still just carried on going up. And that was coupled with this trend of moving out of town, moving to these sort of estates that were very car dependent, and just generating these large increases in travel. And I think whilst we have, you know, these visions, I mean, Jose mentioned, you know, having lots of visions, but it's acting on it that counts. Again, we've had that. Garden cities are this vision. But it's the actual regulations and the enforcement and the financial weight behind it that counts. So they start off with promises of certain agreements that are going to dedicate monies to sustainable initiatives, and that money never gets spent, and there's no way of actually making sure it gets spent. And it's these are things which we've been talking about for decades. Actually, quite, in a sense, simple things, in as much as we can do something about those types of regulations and financing mechanisms, and we haven't. So huge hopes for this white paper, but as we have been in this situation and reviewed these things in the past, and they haven't changed.
Thank you. I'll come to you, Marguerite, in a minute in relation to your hopes for the white paper and how that might work. But just to put a bit of a Dutch context first, Eric, this is obviously an area that you've written about a lot and had a great deal of involvement. You mentioned your hybrid orientated developments at the start of this presentation. So perhaps now's a good point, a time to say, how does that address the issues and the concerns that we've just been hearing about from Gillian?
Yes, sure. I think that's good to mention. And please bring in my slides then. The first, I will come back to the idea of how we do that with new housing developments later on. But first, let me, yes, if you look at this for a typical daily commute, you see that what I understand mostly, I've been to the UK a lot, and besides from London, if you look at the rest of your country, a lot of people live in more rural areas or in smaller towns. And you see that from the top, you see that most people do commute by car because it's the easiest way to go around. And some people are more sustainable and they choose for the train or a metro line and then walk the last few 100 meters to their office. Now, the idea of the HOD, the hybrid oriented development, in the best sense, is that we do the combination of bike, train, and bike. So you take your bike to the nearest train station, then you go swiftly with a train to the train station nearby your office, and that's the final part of your bike ride. In the Netherlands, almost 50% of all train travelers arrive by bike at the train station. So that's why we need all those new large bike parkings like the new one now recently opened this week in The Hague with about 7,000 bike parking places. Now, what we see now in this COVID times is that a lot of people are a bit afraid to travel by train. So I assume that more and more people also will take the car, and in partly that's not the best for decarbonizing, though. We have a lot of faith in electrifying cars. The last picture shows, in fact, from people will go by car, but let them stop at a park and bike place to cycle the last part to the city or to their workspace to at least have some movement a day. And then please show the next slide. Because what I think that should happen in land use planning is that we integrate more the idea of mobility and infrastructure with land use planning. So in earlier times, let's say the modernists thought, okay, we make some segregation between where people live and where people work, and then you get these huge distances, and there's even other places where people can go for recreation. So I think we build more and more nowadays in the Dutch situation in more compact and mixed use, which makes it easier for people to go around by bike, maybe by electric bike, and to do all those activities within a range of, let's say, about 10 to 15 miles. And that's a bit like how we did it in the last 10, 20 years. If you took the next slide, I'll show you one example of what we call the Phoenix housing development. So here you see, in fact, this is in orange is it suppose the reach of the hybrid-oriented development in Rotterdam and The Hague. So on top is The Hague and below is Rotterdam, where Jose is working. And you see that most of the area is covered with its orange bubbles, which shows the cycling distance to a train station. And all the blue dots on this map are the new housing developments, let's say from between 3, 4 to 10,000 new homes, that most of them were built within the reach of this cyclable distance to a train station, which makes it much easier for people to start a sustainable travel.
Thank you, Eric. And Roger, we started this conversation just with me summarising the Transport for New Homes report. I realise that's something that you're well aware of, but just in terms of the planning paper, obviously Gillian's made the point that we seem to have been talking about these problems with planning for decades in terms of failing to, well, effectively not enabling active travel and designing it out and planning for poor health effectively right at the start. What needs to happen this time round to make sure we do it differently?
Well, there's a lot to be said to answer to that one. The first bit is where the most obvious one, which is the government is about to produce some new cycling design guidance. We've been waiting for it a long time. They promised it back in 2018. They said it would be out by the end of 2018. They're still saying it'll be out in the summer. Fingers crossed. We need to make sure that it's written into the plan white paper that development, that the street layouts, the junction layouts, the provision of cycle parking and so on incorporates those cycle-friendly design standards. That's the bare minimum, but that only gets us so far. I'm sure Gillian would agree that it doesn't help if all we do is have developments that have some nice cycle facilities and a few nice token gesture trees, but they are a long way from any decent public transport, and therefore as soon as you want to go anywhere outside the development, you jump in your car. So they've also got to be located in the right places. And this is where one of Gillian's colleagues, well, probably actually a team of Gillian's colleagues, I suspect, Robin Lovelace, who will be well known to anybody who's following cycle policy. Robin's been doing all sorts of really useful pieces of work. He's best known in the field of cycle policy for having created the lead programmer for the Propensity to Cycle tool, more recently, which allows local authorities to see which roads and streets have the greatest potential for increased cycle use under various scenarios of general increased growth in cycling in the future. He's also done some really useful recent work on where should the local authorities spend their money to, where are there wide roads with potential for increased cycling to help guide their spending on the pop-up infrastructure that is now that some of the local authorities are now focusing on. But he's also doing a piece of work on how do you identify the plots of land that are most cycle and pedestrian accessible. And this is going to be really, really important that sort of data is integrated into the planning white paper to help ensure that we build things in the right places, and that where we do create new settlements, we build in good public transport infrastructure into them in right at the outset. Eric's graphic just now with the orange bubbles and the purple developments, it was good. It showed that quite a lot of the purple was inside the orange bubbles of being within good cycling accessibility of a train station. But I would have also expected that those purple patches that were outside of an orange bubble should have had a good public transport link built into them from the outset. If we're going to do development other than in cycle or walk accessible locations, we've got to build the public transport in from the outset. But the more development we do within existing public transport accessible locations, the better.
Maybe to briefly add to that, Roger, because it's a good point you made, and I forgot to say that if you look at the one of the lines there that used to be a train line is now converted to a light rail line, and which is in fact the new starting point for a lot of those commuters to go between Rotterdam and The Hague, which is indeed so popular at the moment that it's too busy to sit anytime. So yeah. It works, but you have to invest both in infrastructure and do it in time, because also in some other settlements it was done a bit too late, and then people already are used to go by car and they buy a second car for a family, and then you're far behind.
Exactly, thank you, Terry. And that's exactly where I think Steve Chambers's point that Duncan relayed just now, that if you don't spend the money on the public transport infrastructure where it's needed, it's going to end up being an unsustainable development, whatever you call it at the outset.
Jose, can I bring you in just at this point? Obviously, you've heard the other panelists speak on this issue, and obviously your job is as an urban planner. So what's your experience in terms of how the Dutch have managed to look at the integration of urban planning and infrastructure a little bit better, perhaps, than we have?
Well, on a regional scale, the examples that Eric just showed, we are trying to implement that on a city scale. And as you probably know, the city of Rotterdam was bombed during the World War. And for a long time, there was like a lack of people living in the city center. And obviously, it's not only about the city center, but this has been my main field of work. So that's why I can share experiences of. And we have decided since around 2008 to densify the city center instead of building outside the city skirts. And this was mainly because of the relation with public transport and creating more support for public transport in our city. I could show you a picture of one of the results we can be proud of, I guess. This is the first slide in the presentation. This is we have a central station, but this picture shows a new building. This is a market hall where there's also apartments in it. So this was one of these projects, part of our densification strategy. And somewhere in between this circle on the left bottom of the market hall, that's one of the other important stations in our city. And we've, it was on purpose that we decided to add more housing, just even right on top of this train station. But not only that, the next slide shows a new bike parking facility in this area. And I think this is a very good example of integrating, well, it's a mixed use area where there's public transport, which is also very good accessible for pedestrians. Because of this parking facility on the -1 level, we were able to create good public space on the square. So this is one of the examples that was part of this mixed use planning in Rotterdam. Yeah, there's more that I can explain, but you probably have another question.
Well, just at that point, it's probably sensible. We're nearly 55 minutes in, and I've not put any questions from the audience. And there was one question that's come in, which was, can the public play a role in encouraging developers to create the kind of housing they want to live in and the high streets that they want to visit, offering a variety of travel options, particularly active travel? For anyone to pick that up, it I think probably touches on some of your campaigning over the years, Roger. So do you want to start on that? Is there anything the public can do to put pressure on in relation to this?
Yes, but there's only so much the public can do at the moment. Actually, the onus has really got to be first and foremost on national policy. That is for two reasons. Partly because in the places where unsustainable development is most problematic, there are few people already there. And those who are there are likely to end up being simply dismissed as NIMBYs. But even the people who are in those more rural areas who are suddenly about to find themselves with an unsustainable town dumped sort of on the field next door to them, they are not helped by the policy framework. the policy framework doesn't. We still live in an era where, you know, presumption of what is supposedly sustainable development, but sustainable development was pretty much defined as any development. We haven't really written that out of the policy script yet. That we ought to be testing the sustainability of developments, particularly in terms of their overall contribution to carbon dioxide emissions from the travel patterns they generate. If that is not integral to the planning to the planning process, then the efforts of whoever is affected by a development near them is trying to say this must be sustainable. This is possibly trying to argue that this is too much housing in the wrong place. They're going to lose because the planning policy framework says no, you can build it. So we've got to get the planning policy framework right in order for citizens to be able to then play their part.
I see you nodding, Gillian. You want to add on to that one?
Yes, I mean, I can't disagree with any of that at all. And what I was just thinking was that I think that for the bigger picture, you know, for the strategic planning of where we're going to put more and more housing, I think that's limited. It probably, with the best will in the world, limited for public engagement. But I'm wondering whether in a post-COVID world there may be more, you know, Roger mentioned the sort of pop-up cycle routes that we've got. Well, there has been engagement around that, people also being invited to suggest where pavements should be widened, where cycling, where they'd like to see cycling. We could do with some more of that. The other thing I was thinking of, though, when Jose showed her pictures earlier of the parklets, I'm sure, I know Roger will know more about this than me, but I think there have been movements by residents in certain places to say, look, I don't have a car. I'd like my equivalent car parking space out there on the street to be given over to parking spaces or a parking lockup or even a car club car or something. Or I'd like to put some planters out there and be able to sit out there or whatever. And my understanding is that we just have so many barriers up in terms of everything from sort of signage and putting paintwork on a street and every bureaucratic red tape element there. So we, you know, so these things are you know, to make them easy for people and people to actually go forward with their ideas. There's so many layers of constraining factors everywhere.
Sorry, if I may have misunderstood the question. It's fair to say, my answer was, I think there is a limited ability for people to really engage in influencing planning. That's not to say don't bother. It's really important that people try to influence planning, as in land use planning. But I think Gillian's absolutely right. There's much greater scope for influencing street planning. And that's exactly why we've, you know, Duncan and his team have been helping create tools and use tools that have been created by others. Widen My Path as a way of crowdsourcing input, people's ability to sort of put a pin on a map and say, this street should have a cycle lane. This street should be closed to motor vehicles. This street should have a widened pavement. There is a website called Widen My Path. We've integrated it into our own website so that people can nominate the locations that most need those fixes. So as I say, people can really engage in street planning, and the more of that, the better. And the one thing we've done, which adds to Widen My Path, is that we've allowed people to see that Widen My Path data overlaid on those maps that I mentioned earlier that Robin Lovelace has created, so that local authorities can now see both. They can both see both data evidence of where cycle lanes are most needed and crowdsourced data as to where they'd be most popular. And where they align, then it's a no-brainer. So yes, absolutely get stuck in.
Just on the issue of that Gillian was mentioning about parking, it ties in with a question that we've got coming from Imogen Makepeace, and Imogen's asking about the resistance that she receives or people get from shopkeepers when there's a suggestion that parking might be given up for some form of active travel or for other space or for a more different urban realm. Obviously, we have experience of that in terms of how those objections are overcome in the UK. But can I just throw that over to you first? Yeah, Josie and then Eric as to what's been the experience in Holland in relation to people objecting to their parking space being taken out, and how those objections have been dealt with to try and convince people it's not going to be the end of the world for them.
Yeah, well, we are dealing with the exact same issues in our city, and it's I think two things have been very helpful. First was a new coalition in politics that was more progressive, and they helped us. We have implemented this plan to create more parking in built facilities outside the city skirts, and then travel by public transit or bike to the city center. And related to that, the politicians, they targeted to eliminate on-street car parking. So that really helped us. But obviously, that's not the point where you're at now. So I think what could be helpful is these tactical interventions, because this example that I showed you about the bike parklet, we did the same with terrace parklets and parklets with green. And if you just say it's only an experiment, you don't have to convince them yet, but in most of the cases, they will be convinced after the experiment, because they've seen that people were happy, and it's also their customers walking on that street, enjoying a more attractive area. And it's not only the customers that will park their cars in front of this shop. Most of the time, it's the shop owner himself. And another thing that really helped, the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, they did a research on the relation between parking and the amount of money that people were spending in those shops. And as it turned out, it was the cyclists and the pedestrians that were spending more money. There's also research been done that shows the other way around. But my point is that it could help to do this research and just to start a conversation with these entrepreneurs, and at the same time to just see if there's some possibility to just start an experiment. And I agree with Eric that about these tactical interventions, they should never be your main objective. It's only a tool to create, to start a transition.
Erica, do you want to come in there in relation to that issue?
Yes, I think just briefly, I also would like to mention this research about the spendings compared to motorists and cyclists. But maybe to give a good example, and if you're on the opportunity to go to visit The Hague, then you can see that in our main shopping street, for about, let's say, 15 to 20 years ago, it was dominated by cars and trams, and the whole street was packed with that, and there was nearly no space for cyclists and pedestrians. And then the city council decided to make it a pedestrian and cycle-friendly lane. In fact, trams are now underground, and there are no cars more allowed there. So the shopkeepers there, most of them were a bit curious about it in the first sense, but since it has been realized, they're very happy with it, because it really provides them more customers and more spendings than before. So I think it's a good example of how things turn out to be quite reasonable for shopkeepers as well. And let me finish with my point that I think that one of the problems is that most of the traffic designers, they think from their first point of view is the car. And I would say makes bicycles the default also in thinking about public space. So design the street from the facade with first space for the walking and cycling, and not from the roadway. So do not assume the sidewalk and the cycle path as a residual space, but make it the main space in the thinking of your traffic designer as well.
on the issue of sort of winning over hearts and minds of businesses, there's a linked question that's come in, Roger, which I'll just sort of tee up and sort of slightly put to you, which is from somebody asking about wanting to organise a bike train for their son's school and linking in with the whole issue of how you win hearts and minds when you're wanting to make some of these changes in relation to how the local community looks and is designed.
Well, yes, absolutely. There's you know, it's very easy to sort of start thinking, well, the way to clamp down on sort of excessive car dependence is to sort of, you know, price it, make it miserable for people to drive and all the rest of it. But absolutely, it's so important to have a positive vision. I think this is where some Jose's stuff about just making the street really nice as a way of reviving it is so important. So the idea that if we're talking, did I understand it right that this is about a sort of, you know, a cycle train to get to school? How do you win people over to taking part?
Yes, I was linking it slightly with the earlier question as well, Roger, about convincing businesses that this wasn't going to be the end of the world, but it's a broader question of winning hearts and minds and winning community support, I suppose.
Yes, if I can make the link between those 2 points, yes, because yeah, absolutely, the children enjoying travel together is such an important part of that winning hearts and minds. But I will link it back to that point about the design of the streets and how you win the businesses over, and to the earlier discussion about planning. One of the problems we've got in this country is the legacy of all of the out of town supermarkets and developments that were allowed to develop back in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And now the perception is that with our high streets dying as a result of all the shopping that's going on in out-of-town superstores and all the rest of it, the way in which to revive the high street, so it is argued, is, well, we've got to provide free car parking so that they can compete with the out-of-town superstores. This is complete nonsense. We've got to make sure that the way in which we revive the high street is by making it a much nicer place than the out-of-town superstores. And yes, that probably does need to be backed up by some pricing mechanisms, by whether it's fuel duty, whether it's non-residential parking levies, or whatever it is. But ultimately, the argument, the hearts and minds argument, is going to be won by making the urban street, whether it's a residential street or a shopping street, a much nicer place to be.
Chris Rowe has asked a brilliant question, which is going to be a tricky one for you all because it's the one thing question, but I'm going to put it to you anyway. And Chris asks, to all of the panel, if we all agree that we need to be more local and reduce the need for longer journeys, what is the one thing we can do today to make this happen? And I'm going to assume that Chris doesn't mean we as in individually, but we as almost societal in relation to that. So it's what is the one thing that we societally can do to make this happen? I'm not going to pick on anybody, so I'll leave somebody to speak first if they've got any thoughts. Julian.
I'll go first because I always put the skeptical point. But I mean, I think if we want to stay local, the corollary of that is that we need to reduce the desire, the ability, the affordability of travelling further afield to do stuff that perhaps we don't need to travel that far to do. So we do, whilst I believe that behaviour is dictated by a lot more than pricing, I'm not an economist, I do think that the prices across our transport system are completely screwed up, excuse my language, but they are a mess. It can be much more cost effective to travel further afield than to travel less distance, particularly in our system. So whether it's public transport pricing or whether it's road pricing, the cost of motoring, the cost per mile travelled, we have to completely structure our pricing so that the further you go, the more expensive it is, and that you really feel that.
Anybody else want to jump in at that point?
I'm sort of going to agree, but just only add a bit to that, because yes, I talked about creating nicer streets, but I did also say we've got to do something around pricing. And although when you sort of say what is the one thing, there is no single one thing, but pricing is probably the one thing without which the rest of the package would not work. If we're going, we can do as much as we like to make our streets, our shopping streets, our community streets nicer, more pedestrian friendly, more cycle friendly. But if we don't do something to reduce, to clamp down on long distance travel, for all the reasons that Gillian said in her opening remarks, in her first remarks, we will fail unless we have some restraint policies in place. At the same time, restraint policies will not be politically acceptable without that wider package that makes it nicer to do the alternative things, to make our urban centre streets, to make our urban communities nicer places. Because if we only do sticks without carrots, then the public isn't going to buy it. So we've got to. So there is no one single thing. All I'd say is pricing is the one thing without which the rest would not work.
There's a question that's come in from in relation to people who perhaps are going to struggle with the idea of getting on a bike and are a bit reluctant to do it. And the question is really about different mobility vehicles. It touches on the issue of mobility scooters, and it also touches upon e-scooters in relation to that, and whether we should be doing more to promote those as alternatives as well. Has anybody got any views in relation to that?
Well, in our city, we are promoting like these electric scooters, but obviously it's in terms of decarbonizing and stuff, it's interesting, but for people's health, I'd rather have them to go cycling or walking. So we do facilitate these companies to, but we have designated areas for these e-scooters. But in our policy, the stimulation campaigns are more related to active travel. And one point that we haven't talked about yet is that this was all about planning and infrastructure. I'm an urban planner myself, but I've started to collaborate with my colleagues of more social, the social departments. I think it's also about behavior. And in Rotterdam, we have projects mainly in the southern part of the city where people weren't used to start cycling from early ages on. And we've started to teach them on schools as well as people that weren't born in the Netherlands. So it's all part of like a package, investing in infrastructure, but also in like behavior and campaigning.
Roger, can I ask you about that and the importance of linking infrastructure and the need for that, but linking it with behavior change campaigning?
Yes, this is particularly important if we're going to sort of broaden not just the number of people who cycle, but the range, if you like, the demographic range of who cycles. If we're really going to, as I said earlier, that cycling in the UK is very male dominated. It's white, young to middle-aged male dominated in a way that is, and that is not the case in the Netherlands. There's a much broader demographic of people who cycle in the Netherlands. Now, it is often said with cycling, build it and they'll come. And that has some truth to it, but it's insufficient. If you build the right cycle facility in the right place, then some people will come. However, if we really want to kind of reach out and make cycling an activity for young people, for children, for older people, for people with health conditions, for people with disabilities, then we've got to do some stuff. We've got to do more than just build it and expect them to come. We've got to have those practical projects that give those people the opportunities to try before you buy, to use a phrase that you used earlier, Duncan, to have that a bit of hand holding, to try out the e-bike, to discover that actually the e-bike is the solution that they'd never realized was right for them. That actually, as soon as you get on an e-bike, wow, it is such fun. E-bikes eat miles, they eat hills, and they are just such fun. But people don't know that until they've tried one out. And it's so important because the people who are unlikely to cycle without that helping hand are the people who would most benefit from doing so. The people with the health conditions, people with disabilities, older people. The benefits of getting those people to take up cycling are huge. and yet it's not sufficient to build them, to just build cycle facilities and expect them to come. They need those behavioural, those behaviour change projects alongside the infrastructure. They need to go hand in hand.
Thank you very much, Roger. I'm afraid I'm going to have to sort of bring that towards an end at this point, because we're about to click over to 1 minute to go of our 1 hour and 15 minutes. So I hope those people listening, all of you listening, have enjoyed this afternoon. It isn't supposed to be, or it hasn't been supposed to be, an answer to every question that might raise. I'm sorry if we've not got to all your questions. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you to the Dutch Embassy for helping us to promote this webinar. We've got loads more information in relation to how we enable more people to cycle on the CyclingUK website. So if you're interested in doing so, please go to www.cyclinguk.org, where we've got loads of information about this webinar and the others we've promoted. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the speakers. And with that, I will bring this to an end as it turns over to 3:15. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.